Have you ever wondered why some countries run their front brake on the right and their back brake on the left? Maybe you run them the other way around. Well, stick around and find out what Pope Boniface VIII, potholes and the first ever motorbikes have to do with the way we set up our brakes. We're really lucky here on gmbntech. We get to ride a wide variety of very nice bikes from lots of different companies and in lots of different countries. But there's always one thing we have to double check before we head out onto the trails. I mean, yeah, probably we check tyre pressure and fork pressure, but the most important one which we check is which side the front brake is on because, well, you can get an OTB if you do it wrong. Here in the UK, along with Japan, Australia, and I think just New Zealand, and it's often referred to as moto style, we run our front brake on the right and our rear brake on the left. It's a nice setup. However, the rest of Europe, the US, and possibly the whole rest of the world run, well, what we call Euro style, where they run their front brake on the left and they run their rear brake on the right. Let's start on the road, and we'll start with well, we won't start with cars actually, because before cars there were horses and carriages, and before horses and carriages, well, they were just horses and just people. So we're going back in time, a long time before mountain bikes even existed. It's thought that in Britain, people travelling by road would use the left side as they passed oncoming strangers on the right, thus keeping their sword arm always towards the passerby, ready to draw it as if they were a mugger. Well, they're not a mugger, but the other person on the road. I know, it was dark times. The keep left rule did not become actual law in Britain until, well, an increase in horse traffic caused all sorts of traffic problems. And, well, it had to be enforced. But before this, people just chose which part of the road they were going to be on and chose the one with the least potholes. In the year 1300, over in Europe, Pope Boniface VIII instructed pilgrims to keep to the left of the road. It wasn't until later class distinctions in France meant that aristocrats drive their carriages on the left side, pushing everyone else over to the right. The subsequent revolutionary wars and Napoleon's European conquest led to the spread of driving on the right to countries like Switzerland and Germany and Spain. But there's a finer thread to this, in that Napoleon was left-handed, so switching the direction of driving to the right meant that he could draw his sword with his left hand. Around 90% of the world's population is right-handed, which adds to the question, if the majority of Napoleon's army were right-handed, would more of his conquests have been successful if they'd driven on the left-hand side? Fast forwarding to the present, you'd think each country would have made their mind up about which side to drive on. Wrong. September the 3rd, 1967 was a big day for Sweden. No, IKEA wasn't invented.
On September the 3rd, Sweden becomes the last country in continental Europe to drive on the left-hand side of the road and switches over to the right.
They decided that after hundreds of years of driving on the left, they'd switch to driving on the right. And as you can probably guess, chaos ensued. Sweden's population was just under 8 million people, with 1,976,248 registered vehicles, which meant it took months and months of preparation and lots of confused drivers for weeks afterwards. The move coincided with the rest of Scandinavia and Europe having moved to the right-hand side in the years before and during the Second World War. Sweden were the outliers, so when a driver crossed the border, they'd have to, well, change to the opposite side of the road, and that works for Swedes going out and Finns or Norwegians coming into Sweden. Another issue that most of the imported cars put the driver in the left seat for driving on, well, the left. Obviously they drive on the left, so rather than driving with the centre line next to them, they're driving on the outside of the road, which led to a rise in accidents. There was a referendum, 82.9% opposed to the change. However, in light of the rise of accidents, the Swedish Parliament decided to overrule and implement the lane change. Motorcycles have influenced the shape, style and technologies found on modern day mountain bikes. Full stop. One of the first motorcycles, basically a bicycle with a motor, literally an engine bolted to it, with a braking system, was made by Steffi Motorcycles of Philadelphia in 1902. It used what's called a spoon front brake, which was operated by a lever on the right hand. Essentially, it pulled the lever and then that pushed down a spoon onto the tyre, applying friction and slowing you down. Nowadays, on a motorbike, the front brake is on the right-hand lever, whilst the rear brake is controlled by your foot using a pedal. However, there is still a lever on the left-hand side of the handlebars, and that's the clutch, which controls the flow of power from the engine through to the gearbox. So you're probably thinking, the US invented the first motorcycle with a front brake, which is on the right, which stuck across all motorbikes. However, they ride their bicycles, be that mountain bikes or road bikes, with a front brake on the left. Why? When it comes to bicycles, there's a number of theories surrounding the configuration of brakes across the world. And one theory is that it's all to do with the French, because early bikes there just had rear brakes and usually a rim brake. They weren't very powerful, so they needed a lot of power through your hand to actually stop the bike. And as most people are right-handed, it made sense to control that one brake with the right hand. Alongside of this, coaster brakes were a thing. They were heavily used in Britain. Essentially, this is a braking system in the hub, and it requires no lever on the handlebars. Towards the middle of the 20th century, many countries adopted a new law requiring 2 brakes on bikes. In France, the right side was already taken up for the rear brake, so it made sense to put it on the left. And the US copied the French, as the US brand Schwinn was one of the only companies importing French road bikes with brakes, so it copied the style. In the UK, coaster brake bikes still had empty handlebars, so the front brake was added just to the right side. So when they finally moved to rim brakes, they added the rear brake onto the left-hand side. Makes sense. I'm going to continue talking about riding on the road, so bear with me. Now, I spoke about the early days of using horses for transport, and the Brits, well, the right hand was reserved for drawing a sword. Fast forward quite a few years, I mean hundreds of years, and the same can be observed when riding on the road, well, minus the swords, and there's quite a lot less horses now. But whether you're in the UK or in the US, riding on the left or on the right, the theory is that you're using your inner hand to signal a turning or stopping.
Look behind to find an opening, give a clear right-hand signal. When it's safe to do so, move to the middle of the road, keeping your right hand out all the time.
It meant that you could always have your outside hand covering the rear brake, meaning that if you had to stop, you'd be able to slow down gradually. Because if it was the other way around and you pulled hard on that front brake, the other hand could fall off the bar and, well, you just fly over the handlebars into the road, which is less than ideal. Nowadays, brakes are getting much more powerful and much more responsive, and most riders use their left hand to signal a left turn and their right hand to signal a right turn. So, here's my take on why the front brake should always be on the right. We touched on the fact that 90% of people have a more dominant right hand. The front brake is the most useful brake. Everyone knows that. With your forward weight transfer as the bike slows, it in turn makes sense that your front brake is on the right hand side, as it means you're using your stronger hand to operate it, one with better motor skills. I mean, I guess a caveat is, well, today's standard of hydraulic disc brake, the power and modulation means that you don't really need to use your dominant hand to use your front brake, because you can just use a really light touch to come to a stop in, well, just mere seconds. Paired with really big rotors and big grippy tyres, my whole argument goes out the window. Damn it. Okay, there we have it. A brief overview of why brakes are on different sides in different countries. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of history buffs ready to wage their opinion in the comments, so please do get involved down below and tell us, which side is your front brake on?